My father once told me, truth is what the powerful say it is. Back then, I believed him. Until the day that same power crushed my $62,000 scholarship and my name just because I refused to follow his path. He built his fame on theories the world worshipped. I built my silence into a weapon he never saw coming. Have you ever been erased by someone who claimed to love you? I didn't just expose him. I rewrote his legacy, line by line, until the truth he feared most carried my signature. People used to tell me how lucky I was to be Professor Ward's daughter. I smiled like I was supposed to, even when that word, lucky, felt heavier than it should. My childhood wasn't filled with bedtime stories or playground laughter. It was filled with lectures, equations scribbled on napkins, philosophy served at breakfast. My father didn't raise a daughter. He raised a project he could be proud of. He liked to say knowledge was love, but his version of love came with conditions. Every praise was a transaction, earned through achievement, withdrawn the moment I failed to meet his expectations. When I brought home straight A's, he would nod, satisfied but not surprised. When I tried painting or writing, he would look at me as if I had spoken a foreign language. He didn't yell. He didn't need to. Disappointment can be silent, and silence can crush louder than any word. By the time I turned 18, I had learned how to measure my worth in published results. I thought that was normal. He called it discipline. I called it love because I didn't know better. Westbrook University offered me a scholarship in data ethics, a field that combined technology and morality, a space where logic met empathy. I remember the look on his face when I told him it wasn't anger. It was worse. It was disbelief, the kind you reserve for people who should have known better. Ethics, he said, the word lingering in the air like a bad aftertaste. You're throwing away a lifetime of legacy for philosophy? I tried to explain that ethics wasn't philosophy. It was accountability. It was the thing science forgot. He laughed, soft, condescending, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes. Then he patted my shoulder and said, "You'll come around." But I didn't. The day I received the scholarship confirmation, I thought he might finally be proud. He attended my graduation, shook my hand, smiled for photos. Everyone saw a proud father and a brilliant daughter. They didn't see the call he made that evening to a colleague in the funding committee. They didn't see how easily his reputation could bend the world around him. I didn't know any of that yet. I just remember feeling like I was finally free, like the chains of his expectations had cracked, even if just a little. If I could go back, I'd tell that girl to pay attention. The illusion of freedom is still a cage, just with better lighting. Because when you grow up in the shadow of perfection, you stop noticing the darkness that comes with it. I thought my father's approval was the final test I had to pass. I didn't know it was only the beginning of my undoing. The first sign that something was wrong came quietly. An email from the scholarship board, short, cold, written in the kind of language that sounds polite until you read between the lines. They were reassessing my eligibility due to unverified data sources. I read it 3 times, convinced it was a mistake. I had submitted every document, every citation, every ethical clearance. I lived by transparency. That was the point of my research. At first, I thought it was just bureaucracy, some misunderstanding that could be fixed with a phone call. I called, no one picked up. I emailed, no one replied. Then the university's tone changed too. My advisor, Dr. Reed, stopped returning my messages. Meetings were postponed, then canceled. By the time I realized I'd been blacklisted, it was already too late. The whispers started in the hallways. I'd walk into the lab and conversations would cut mid-sentence. People looked away. One afternoon, I overheard 2 professors talking near the elevator. One of them said, "It's a shame, really. She had potential before that plagiarism issue." Plagiarism? I laughed, a dry, broken sound that scared even me. The accusation wasn't written anywhere official, but it didn't need to be. Rumors have a way of writing their own truth when the right person gives them permission. I didn't sleep for days. I tried to trace the source. The email that triggered the reassessment came from an internal address, restricted to the Westbrook network. When I finally accessed the metadata, my hands started shaking. It was sent from a device registered to the Department of Theoretical Informatics, my father's department. I remember sitting in the dark that night, the glow of my laptop painting my face blue. There was no confrontation, no shouting match, no dramatic discovery. Just silence, a silence that told me everything I needed to know. He had always told me that truth was a matter of perception, that data could be manipulated, narratives rewritten. I just never thought he'd use that lesson against me. When I confronted him, gently, still hoping there was an explanation, he didn't even flinch. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, looked at me over the rim, and said, "You'll understand one day, Elena. Reputation is fragile. I couldn't let you destroy ours." Ours? As if his name and mine were still joined, even after he'd burned the bridge between them. That night, I packed what I could fit into one suitcase. My name was already stained in the academic world. My scholarship gone, my mentor silent, my father untouchable. But somewhere between heartbreak and humiliation, something inside me hardened. I stopped shaking, I stopped crying. For the first time, I saw him not as my father, but as a man who worshipped control more than truth. I left Westbrook before sunrise. The air was cold, and the city looked different, smaller, dishonest, but strangely full of possibilities. He had destroyed my career. He just didn't realize he'd also created my purpose. When you lose everything, the world doesn't stop. It keeps moving, cold, unbothered, like your pain is just background noise. After Westbrook, I drifted from one short-term contract to another. Small research labs, nonprofit projects, private data analysis jobs that barely covered rent. I was the girl who used to be promising, the one with the famous last name people pretended not to recognize. Boston winters are cruel. They bite through your clothes, straight into your bones. But they're honest in a way people rarely are. The cold doesn't lie, it just is. Maybe that's why I stayed. There was something cleansing about it, something that stripped me down to who I really was when no one was watching. I rented a tiny apartment above a laundromat. The ceiling leaked when it rained, and the radiator hissed like it resented me. But it was quiet, no whispers, no expectations, no father's shadow. I worked nights, ran simulations by day, and taught myself to code algorithms faster than I could fall asleep. At first, it was just survival. But one evening, while organizing old files, I found an unfinished draft of my scholarship proposal, the one he buried. Reading my own words felt like meeting someone I used to love. The proposal wasn't about rebellion or defiance. It was about fairness, transparency, and how power corrupts truth when left unchecked. That's when the idea returned, not as revenge, not yet, as clarity. If my father could use influence to erase truth, then I could use data to reveal it. I started building the foundation of what would later become Project Verity. The name came to me late one night while watching snow fall through the window. Verity, meaning truth, but a truth not controlled by legacy or name, only by evidence. The early versions were crude, lines of code that barely ran, graphs that made no sense. But every failure taught me something. I learned to mask my IP address, to publish under pseudonyms, to disappear behind clean metadata trails. The invisibility that once felt like punishment became my protection. I wrote a single line in a notebook I kept beside my laptop. Truth doesn't need permission. It became my mantra. Years passed that way, quiet, anonymous, but alive. I stopped chasing recognition. I started chasing integrity. I built friendships in small online forums, collaborating with people who cared more about the data than the name attached to it. None of them knew who I really was, and that made the work pure again. Each night, as I coded under the dim yellow light of that apartment, I'd catch my reflection in the laptop screen, tired eyes, but steady. There was something almost sacred in that solitude. They thought I was gone, but in the silence they left me with, I was rebuilding, bit by bit, line by line. And one day, when the storm finally came, I knew I'd be ready to face it. It started small, almost accidental. A research forum posted an open call for data modelers to help visualize bias trends in academic publishing. I submitted a few graphs under a pseudonym, nothing fancy, just clean and honest work. 2 days later, a moderator messaged me. "Your visualizations are the most accurate we've ever seen." For the first time in years, someone noticed my work without knowing my name. It felt pure, liberating. I created a new online identity, a quiet voice that contributed to discussions, uploaded code, answered questions. I didn't brag, didn't lecture, I just built, tested, refined. Over time, people began tagging me in threads, asking for feedback, quoting my code in their papers. My handle became a reference point, not famous, just trusted. That was enough. The research I focused on had one goal: mapping systemic bias. I wanted to understand how some researchers' work was always accepted, even when their data was weak, while others were buried no matter how solid their evidence. It didn't take long before patterns began to appear: networks of mutual citations, journal gatekeeping, academic nepotism. And there, glowing on my screen like a quiet betrayal, was the name Gregory Ward. His publications showed the highest correlation of favorable peer reviews and citation clustering. It was all there, hidden in plain sight, an empire built not on truth but on hierarchy. I stared at the data until my eyes burned. It wasn't shock anymore, it was validation. Everything I had suspected was real. I refined the algorithm, expanded the dataset, cross-referenced decades of academic records. Each test confirmed what the numbers whispered: influence had replaced integrity. Every time I pressed run, another layer of his illusion peeled away. But here's the strange thing about uncovering truth. You start to see how deep the rot goes. It wasn't just him, it was the system that rewarded men like him for guarding the gates of knowledge and calling it excellence. As my research gained traction, collaborators began reaching out. Independent labs wanted to test my models. Editors asked for permission to cite my work. A small journal published one of my analyses, still under my pseudonym, and it quietly spread among data scientists. I could have revealed myself then. I could have signed my name, taken the credit, claimed my redemption, but I didn't. Because the moment I put Ward on anything, it would stop being about the data, it would become about him again. So I stayed invisible, letting the truth speak louder than my identity ever could. Each night, I wrote progress notes in a journal, the one that used to be his. Underneath his neatly written equations, I scribbled my own words. The system that hides bias can be dismantled by the very code that built it. For the first time, I felt like I was no longer running from my father's legacy. I was rewriting it. And though no one knew my name, in the quiet corners of academia, my work had already begun to shift the ground beneath his feet. It happened slowly, like frost creeping over glass, silent, delicate, impossible to stop once it began. My father's name still appeared in every academic conference, every journal preface, every textbook citation. He was the pillar of integrity, the man who defined how research should be validated. But somewhere in those polished halls, a whisper began to circulate. It started with a single paper, a small research collective questioning the reproducibility of his earlier models. They used my algorithm, Project Verity, as part of their analysis. The results didn't accuse him outright, but they raised an uncomfortable question. Were academic hierarchies influencing peer review outcomes? The thread spread quietly across forums and subreddits. A few professors called it a witch hunt. Others, the brave ones, called it overdue. For me, sitting behind a screen in my tiny apartment, it felt surreal. My code, the same code I built out of pain, was now being used to hold people accountable, including him. He responded predictably, a public statement, a lecture on the dangers of unverified data and algorithmic bias. It was clever, elegant, and utterly hollow. He called the researchers well-meaning but naive. That was his favorite insult, disguised as mentorship. I watched the recording of that speech more times than I want to admit. He looked older, though he'd never acknowledge it. His voice carried that same calm authority, the same control that once shaped my entire childhood. But beneath it, I could hear something new, a tremor, the first hint of fear. A few months later, the Journal of Data Ethics, the same one that had published my anonymous analyses, issued an editorial on transparency and open review. They cited the growing influence of open-source bias detection algorithms. My father wasn't named, but anyone who could read between the lines understood what it meant. Behind the scenes, people began to distance themselves. Invitations to keynote conferences decreased. Two of his co-authors removed their names from collaborative projects. The cracks were forming, even if the structure still looked unshakable from the outside. I didn't gloat. I didn't celebrate. Instead, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Control, but not the kind he worshipped. Mine was quieter, rooted in patience. I kept refining Project Verity, teaching it to see what humans couldn't: citation inflation, hidden bias, conflict of interest disguised as peer validation. Each update made the algorithm sharper, more irrefutable. Every piece of data brought me closer to dismantling the empire of illusion he'd built. One night, a notification appeared on my screen. A new preprint had been uploaded. Another team citing Project Verity. The title made my breath catch. Statistical integrity and the collapse of legacy metrics. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the system he embodied. As I scrolled through the paper, my eyes landed on a footnote that read, "We thank the anonymous contributor whose code made this research possible." Anonymous? That was me. And somewhere across the city, I imagined him reading those same words, realizing for the first time that control, like reputation, is an illusion. There are battles that don't happen in courts or with raised voices. Some are fought in footnotes, in lectures, in the quiet exchange of ideas that bleed into public opinion. That was the kind of war my father and I found ourselves in. Two people standing on opposite sides of truth, both fluent in logic, both unwilling to yield. He began writing again. A series of essays defending the sanctity of academic tradition. They were sharp, polished, manipulative in the way only he could make lies sound noble. He argued that the rise of algorithmic analysis threatened the human element of scholarship, that machines could never understand integrity the way men did. I read every line. And then, under my pseudonym, I replied. My paper wasn't emotional. It didn't need to be. It spoke in the language he respected most, data. I broke down every point he made, not with anger, but with evidence. Where he spoke of intuition, I showed statistical inconsistency. Where he invoked legacy, I countered with transparency. The academic community noticed. Forums lit up with debates. Can truth be measured by code? Is human bias the last unacknowledged flaw in science? My name never appeared, but my ideas did, and they began to echo louder than his. He must have known it was me. Our sentences carried the same rhythm, the same patterns of thought. His reflection twisted into something freer. In one of his interviews, when asked about the new anonymous scholar challenging his theories, he smiled tightly and said, "Every generation believes it's reinventing the truth, but truth doesn't evolve, it endures." I remember staring at the screen, my chest tightening. I whispered to myself, then let's see if it endures this time. I wrote my next paper, Integrity as a System, Not a Slogan. It wasn't a rebuttal, it was a manifesto. It laid bare everything wrong with the culture he represented, the worship of hierarchy, the fear of transparency, the addiction to prestige. I included case studies, including patterns from his own network without naming him. The academic world exploded, half defended him, half praised the anonymous researcher for daring to challenge the status quo. For weeks, our ideas collided across journals and panels. He stood for preservation. I stood for evolution. But underneath it all, there was something painfully human. A father trying to protect his illusion of immortality. A daughter trying to reclaim the truth he'd buried beneath his pride. I didn't want to destroy him, not yet. I wanted him to see it, the shape of the world he'd built collapsing under its own weight. And maybe, just maybe, realize that the truth he had spent a lifetime controlling could no longer belong to him. Because in the end, we weren't just debating research. We were fighting for the definition of what it meant to be honest. The email that changed everything arrived at 2:17 a.m. It came from a researcher in Sweden, someone I'd collaborated with anonymously for years. His message was simple. Your algorithm is ready. It's time to go public. For a moment, I just stared at the screen. I could hear the soft hum of my laptop, the radiator hissing behind me, the world holding its breath. 7 years of silence, of hiding, of quietly building the very weapon that could dismantle everything he stood for. This was the moment it would all surface. I uploaded the final version of Project Verity to an open access platform. No passwords, no paywalls, no author credit. The code was free, transparent, peer verifiable. Within hours, researchers from all over the world began running their own datasets through it. The results were undeniable. It exposed citation manipulation, selective review approvals, and favoritism embedded deep in academic structures. By sunrise, Verity had gone viral. Headlines appeared one after another. Anonymous algorithm challenges integrity of global academia. Decades of research under question. Top professors' theories debunked by open-source code. And there it was, his name. Professor Elena Ward, front and center, standing in the shadow of the truth he could no longer contain. He was invited to a televised interview that night. The anchor introduced him with that polished reverence the media reserves for legends, but I could see it, the stiffness in his jaw, the exhaustion behind his smile. When they showed the data visualization, the colored graph that mapped bias correlations across fields, the red line representing his name was impossible to miss. It wasn't defamation, it was mathematics. He tried to explain it away. He said the algorithm lacked context, that data without wisdom is dangerous. But for the first time, his voice trembled. I watched from my apartment, wrapped in a blanket, laptop glowing in the dark. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I felt still. It wasn't joy, not yet, just the quiet realization that something irreversible had happened. People didn't need to know my name to understand the story. They saw the pattern, the hypocrisy, the legacy built on suppression, and they connected the dots themselves. By the next morning, the university announced an internal review. Funding agencies suspended his grants. The very committee that once honored him now demanded transparency. The empire he built on control was collapsing, one press release at a time. I never posted, never commented, never claimed a thing. But when I looked at the download counter, tens of thousands of people around the world using Project Verity, I realized I didn't need to. The truth didn't need my signature. It finally had its own voice. The fall didn't come all at once, it came in fragments like glass cracking under invisible pressure. First, the journals. The Journal of Data Ethics issued a retraction notice for 3 of his articles, citing statistical inconsistencies. 2 more followed within a week. Then Beacon Academic Press announced they were suspending distribution of his latest book pending review. I knew what that meant. No one wanted to stand next to a collapsing monument. Westbrook University released a statement, a masterpiece of corporate neutrality, acknowledging concerns regarding the integrity of Professor Gregory Ward's research methods. No apologies, no ownership, just enough distance to keep their reputation intact. I watched it all unfold from the same apartment where I had written the code. I didn't celebrate. I didn't tell anyone. It wasn't the kind of victory you could toast to. It was quiet, heavy, inevitable. I saw photos of him online, head down, leaving a lecture hall. The caption read, "Professor Ward declines to comment." He looked smaller somehow, not physically, but in presence. The kind of man who had built an empire on certainty now looked like he was searching for the floor beneath his feet. Some of his colleagues defended him at first. He made mistakes, but his contributions are still invaluable, they said. But when donors withdrew, when the media stopped calling, those voices disappeared too. Reputation, I realized, is a currency that evaporates faster than guilt. One afternoon, I walked past the university for the first time in years. Students were crossing the courtyard laughing, late for class. None of them knew my story, none of them knew his. But inside the main hall, where his portrait once hung, there was now an empty space, a pale rectangle where sunlight hadn't touched the wall in decades. I stood there for a long time, hands in my pockets, watching that blank space. It didn't feel like revenge, it felt like gravity doing its job. That night, I opened my old notebook, the one that used to be his. Between his neat lines of equations, I wrote, "The truth doesn't destroy, it reveals." Emails began flooding in from researchers around the world. Some wanted to collaborate, others just wanted to say thank you. They didn't know who I was, and I preferred it that way. Anonymity kept the work clean. It kept it about the truth, not about me. The news cycle eventually moved on. Another scandal, another downfall. But in the quiet corners of academia, his name became a warning, a reminder of what happens when ambition outruns integrity. And me, I didn't feel lighter, just freer. For the first time in my life, my father's silence wasn't a punishment, it was peace. It had been nearly a year since the collapse when the email invitation arrived. Subject line, Open Knowledge Collective Annual Recognition Ceremony. They were honoring the creators of open source tools that advanced academic integrity. I almost deleted it. I'd spent so long hiding behind a pseudonym that the idea of stepping into any kind of spotlight felt wrong. But as I scrolled to the bottom, one sentence stopped me cold. Among this year's honorees, Project Verity. I didn't reply, I didn't have to. Attendance wasn't about recognition, it was about closure. The ceremony was held in Seattle, in a grand marble hall lined with portraits of pioneers in science and technology. I sat near the back, anonymous as ever, surrounded by people who had unknowingly built upon my work. They spoke about transparency, ethics, the responsibility of truth. Words I had once believed in as ideas, now they were real, spoken aloud, carried by others. Halfway through the program, the host unveiled a plaque mounted on a silver pedestal. It read, Project Verity, Advancing Truth Through Open Knowledge, and beneath it, engraved in small letters, Integrity is a system, not a slogan. My breath caught. That line, my line. The one I'd written at 3 a.m. on a coffee-stained page in that cramped Boston apartment. The crowd applauded. I didn't. I just smiled, quietly to myself. And then I saw him. Professor Gregory Ward, my father. He was sitting at the far end of the hall, older now, thinner, a man stripped of armor. He wasn't listed as a guest of honor, just attending, watching. His hands rested on a cane. His eyes found the plaque, then the words beneath it. He looked up and scanned the room as if searching for something, or someone. For a heartbeat, our eyes met. No words, no gestures, just silence, familiar but changed. In that moment, I saw the man he truly was. Not the villain of my story, not the legend the world had built. Just a man who had lost himself in the pursuit of perfection and was now facing the cost. He didn't look away first. I did, not out of avoidance, but release. After the ceremony, I walked past the plaque one last time. My reflection shimmered faintly on the metal surface, overlapping with the engraved words. It didn't feel like ownership, it felt like return. Outside, the city was washed in evening light. I stepped into it, blending with the crowd, nameless and content. Some truths don't need to be shouted. They just need to exist long enough for the right people to see them. And sometimes, silence can say I forgive you better than any language ever could. Years later, I live a different life. No headlines, no debates, no legacy to protect or destroy. Just a small classroom on the top floor of a community center, sunlight spilling across rows of curious young faces. I teach them about algorithms, about truth, about how systems are only as honest as the people who build them. Most of them don't know who I am, and I prefer it that way. To them, I'm just Ms. Ward, the quiet instructor who always asks, but how do you know it's true? On my desk sits an old leather-bound journal, my father's. The first page still carries his handwriting, precise and proud. The rest is mine, messy, ink-stained, filled with thoughts that don't try to impress anyone. Sometimes when I turn its pages, I imagine him sitting across from me, no longer as the man who tried to control truth, but as someone who finally learned to face it. I don't hate him anymore. Hate is heavy. It keeps you chained to the very thing you're trying to escape. Forgiveness, I've learned, isn't approval, it's release. It's saying, you don't own this part of me anymore. The world has mostly forgotten his name, mine was never known, but Project Verity lives on. Students still use it, journals still reference it. The truth keeps moving forward quietly, just as it should. Sometimes I think about the girl I used to be, the one sitting in the dark, staring at an email that shattered everything she thought she was. If I could speak to her now, I'd tell her this. You don't have to shout to be heard. You just have to keep building something that speaks louder than your pain. That's the lesson I want you to take too. Maybe your betrayal doesn't look like mine. Maybe it's not academic or public or tied to family legacy. But pain is universal, and so is the power to turn it into something honest. Whatever you build, whether it's a code, a painting, a story, let it carry the truth you were denied. Because revenge that only destroys leaves ashes. But revenge that reveals truth, it changes everything. If this story found a place in you, stay with us. Our channel, Heartless Revenge, exists for stories like this, where pain meets purpose and silence becomes strength. Share what part of this story spoke to you. Tell me if you've ever had to rebuild yourself after being erased. I'll read every word, because truth doesn't scream. It simply stands and waits for someone brave enough to listen.